Hello, my name is Paul Boag, and if you're considering building a mobile application, this is the video for you, because I want to help you answer a fundamental question, which is, do I need an app for that? Am I right building a native mobile application, or should I be looking at creating a responsive website? You see, there is huge pressure on us these days to build a native application. It's happened time and time again through digital over the years. First of all, there was a pressure on us to have a website because everybody had a website, so you had to have one too. And then Flash came along and we all felt kind of obliged to have Flash because that was the latest cool trendy thing. And it's happened time and time again, hasn't it? Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, Instagram, these things come along and we feel kind of obliged to jump on the bandwagon, to join the trend. But that's not always a wise thing to do, and it's definitely not a wise thing to do when it comes to building native mobile applications. And that's because building native mobile applications has problems. There are big issues associated with it. Interestingly, one of the main reasons everybody jumped on the apps bandwagon to begin with was the exposure they got from it. Because in the early days of apps, there was more demand than there was supply. But now we live in a very different world. Each app store has over 1 million apps in it, and that is a big number. And it means that your app may well never be seen. If it's not featured, if it doesn't appear on the front pages or the top selling lists or wherever else, then it could effectively be invisible. It's very hard to stand out from the crowd in today's mobile native app market. But that's not the only problem. Users also only have limited space on their device for installing apps. And that means they're very selective of what they put on there. They'll install an app and then they'll quickly delete it if they're not using it regularly enough. But probably the biggest problem with native mobile applications is the cost. They're really expensive to produce, and that's because coding a native application has a high barrier to entry. It's not like coding HTML, CSS and JavaScript, which is relatively straightforward. Coding for these different platforms is expensive and time consuming. And that means that you're going to end up paying a lot of money to produce those native applications. But it's not just going to cost you to build the applications, it's also going to cost you to support them. Every time a new device comes out, a new version of the operating system, it could potentially mess up your app. Bugs will creep in, the display might not be correct for the new screen sizes that come along, and you're going to have to update your app. And that's going to cost you more time and more money. But the biggest expense is that you're going to have to support multiple platforms. There isn't one single dominant supplier when it comes to smartphones. There's Android, there's Windows, there's BlackBerry, and then of course there's iOS as well. And you're going to need to be building for each of these platforms and supporting your applications on each of these platforms. You can't just build once and deliver to all of them, not when it comes to native apps. Now I'm sounding very negative, aren't I? And like I'm criticizing native applications, and that is not the case. There are some situations where having a native app makes a lot of sense. For example, if you're trying to deliver an application that has clearly defined simple tasks you're trying to achieve, then a native app might be the right idea. So for example, one of my favorite apps is OmniFocus. OmniFocus is a task organizer that I use all of the time to keep me on track with my work. And with that clearly defined, simple goal, it makes sense to build a native app. It's not massively complicated and so isn't going to be hugely expensive to develop. There are also those apps that people are using regularly, all of the time, multiple times a day. And those are the kind of apps that, again, you're going to want at your fingertips. So it makes sense for them to be native apps. So a great example of that is updating Twitter. I update Twitter all of the time, and so I'm going to want that at my fingertips. So again, having it as a native app makes a lot of sense. Then another reason to have a native app is that you want to use native features that are not available to you if you build on the web. So a great example of that is an app I use called TomTom. TomTom allows me to find my way around. It's a directional map that accesses my GPS, but it also accesses the compass in order to tell me which way I'm driving and which way I'm facing, etc. And you cannot access the compass on the website, at least not at the moment. It's a feature that is locked down and available only to native applications. So in that case, if you want access to the compass, then yes, of course, you need to build a native app. So how do you make the decision? If you've got great native apps and you've got great responsive websites, how do you decide which way to go? Well, there's no black and white answer, but there is a rule of thumb. If your app tends to be more content-based, then consider going down the responsive website route. If, on the other hand, your app is about completing tasks, then you may well want to consider a native app. So let's look at some examples of maybe where people have got it a little bit wrong. There's a newspaper called The Sun here in the UK, and they have a native app. But actually, if you look at the app, it does nothing that you couldn't do on a responsive website. It's basically news stories. So there is little reason really for them to have a native app. Even offline browsing of news stories is possible within a website. And as a result, they've got very poor reviews for their app because it doesn't really do anything very remarkable. It's very boring and very bog standard and really shouldn't be in the App Store at all. And this actually applies to pretty much any news app because they're very content heavy, aren't they? Another example of an app that probably should be a responsive website is the Holster fashion e-commerce app. Now, if you look at that app, essentially it's an e-commerce website. There is nothing special about it, nothing that means that it has to be natively on the device. It's not really task orientated, it's a shopping app. It's not really using any native features, so that's not a requirement. The only argument you might be able to make is that people use it so much that it has to be native. But somehow I really doubt that. This is not a big e-commerce app like Amazon that potentially people might be ordering things from multiple times a day. No, this is a very specialist fashion app that people are only going to purchase from occasionally. One of the best examples of a genre of app that really shouldn't be in the App Store are celebrity chef apps. There seems to be hundreds of these things, and they play really no particular role that justifies them being on an app store. Almost all of these apps are basically recipe apps. They provide content, and yet they're featured on the App Store. Now, actually, there is a third choice that I haven't touched on. It's not a black and white, should you go for a website or should you go for a native app? There is a middle ground that at face value looks very attractive, and that's a hybrid app. Hybrid apps are basically a framework that you can build your app in and then deliver to multiple platforms. A great example of a hybrid app framework is PhoneGap. Now, what PhoneGap enables you to do is build your application in HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Suddenly that lowers the barrier to entry because a lot more people can build in HTML, CSS and JavaScript that can build native applications. Best of all, you build it once in HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and then PhoneGap will enable you to deliver that across all platforms, across iOS, across Android, across BlackBerry, etc. A great example of an organisation that decided to go down the hybrid route was the BBC. The BBC wanted to provide a content for the Olympics, but obviously that content had a limited shelf life, and so they didn't want to spend huge amounts of money developing native apps across multiple platforms. Now, you might have said, why didn't they build a responsive website? But in their particular case, there was an expectation that they had an app in the App Store. They kind of had to have an Olympics app, whether they wanted to or not. So PhoneGap was a great compromise. It reduced the cost of producing the app, It allowed them to deliver to multiple platforms, which for the BBC is a really important thing because they can't be seen to favour one particular platform. And it also allowed them to have that App Store presence that they needed. But even building a hybrid app is not without its problems. It's easy to see that as the kind of perfect compromise solution, but it's not. For a start, not all native functionality will be available to you if you build a hybrid app. For example, you still couldn't do those turn-by-turn directions I mentioned earlier that TomTom provide me. Hybrid apps can also suffer from performance issues because they're not built in the native language of the platform that you're delivering to. But probably the biggest thing, at least from a user's point of view, is they don't kind of match the native platform you're building for. You see, one of the great benefits of a hybrid app is you can build once and deliver it to all the different platforms. And that means your app isn't going to look like an iPhone app or a Windows app or a BlackBerry app or an Android app. It will have its own unique look and feel. And that can make hybrid apps look a little bit weird, look not quite right, not quite fitting in with the aesthetic of the operating system, and that can put users off. So if each approach has its own drawbacks, what is the answer here? Well, the biggest thing you need to take away is to avoid a knee-jerk reaction. Don't presume you have to be on the App Store just because your competition is. Remember my rule of thumb. If you're delivering primarily content, then consider a responsive website. If it's mainly behavioral that you're doing, then start thinking about a native app, but not before then. Kind of my default position is to build a responsive website and only consider building a native app if it kind of meets the criteria we've discussed in this video. That said, things change very fast on digital, so it's important that you're constantly considering and revising your position because what's right today won't necessarily be right in the future.